Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for attending the webinar today. It is 2:30 on the East Coast, so good afternoon or good morning on the West Coast. My name is Matt Henry, and today we're going to be talking about optimizing programmatic digital outreach to healthcare professionals. So just some logistics. On the bottom left-hand side of your screen, I believe there's a little chat/question icon. So if you do have questions as you go through, feel free to ask them. If I can get to them during the presentation, I will, and if not, I will do my best to address them afterwards. But I've got a pretty full presentation here, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. Let's see if I can make that work. Good. So I want to talk about a few things today. First, maximizing reach across healthcare professionals, because obviously you can't have an effective campaign if you can't reach the right audience. Then I want to talk about improving targeting precision. And this section specifically will talk about who we are targeting and how we identify who we are targeting. Next, I want to talk about using performance data for optimization, and this is where I talk about kind of the other attributes, where we focus primarily on who in programmatic. Also matters where we target them, meaning what site context, what device, when we target them by day or day part, how we target them, what kind of messaging we target them with, all of these things. And there's lots of performance data that can be used and analyzed for the purposes of optimizing those aspects. And then a little bit about measurement. Programmatic in general tends to be more of an anonymous aggregate audience world, but there are certainly things we can do for individual attribution across multiple steps. And then last, privacy compliance. So privacy compliance, rather than being its own section, is going to be kind of interwoven throughout, because I think it's pretty much inherent to everything that I'm going to talk about today. So let's get started. First, about 2 minutes. Just on audience partners, mostly just to provide you context on who I am and on who Audience Partners is, but also a lot of the themes that I'm going to discuss today are kind of touched on as I discuss what we do for a living here. So we are in the business of data-driven audience targeting across multiple channels, primarily the digital channels that you see here, but more and more recently, Addressable TV as an additional channel. And we focus on the things that you see on the bottom of the screen. Data is always first. So during this presentation, I'm going to talk a lot about what better data is. Specifically in this context, it's data that can match at a higher rate and create a better audience, but also a more precise audience. Reach is also important. So, we integrate our data with lots of different ad networks and DSPs and cable providers for addressable TV. And again, that becomes important to HCP outreach because inherently you're talking about a finite audience, and the more publishing inventory you can integrate, the more reach you're going to get, the better buying efficiency you're going to get, et cetera. Again, privacy, very important here. HIPAA won't apply to the HCPs in the same way as it does to consumers, but certainly there's a number of privacy issues that you are probably asked all the time in your jobs, as I know I am in mine, and we'll touch on those today. And then experience, really the point here is that we do have billions of impressions worth of what we call data exhaust, hundreds of millions of those specifically to HCPs, where we can start to understand better when people are engaging and what context and what device and all of those types of things. So one more quick slide on Audience Partners. This is really kind of the platform that we use. We have our data, so I'll talk today when we talk about HCPs about an always-on audience, which is, just what it sounds like, where we can target on a certain number of attributes. We can certainly reach consumers as well, but that won't be the focus today. But then your data, which tends to be more, or a larger percentage, I should say, of the outreach we do, because pharma clients will have specific healthcare professionals. It's unusual, if not unprecedented, to get a request that says, I want to reach all doctors or all primary care physicians. Minimally, it'll be by a specialty, but usually there's some kind of custom scoring involved there. So we'll talk about the match process and match rates, et cetera, for custom audiences. And then online data, and this is really third-party data. This becomes important when we start to think about healthcare professionals as consumers. So we will overtly target healthcare professionals on things like specialty and prescription behavior and network affiliations, but we'll start to build subsegments which give us additional ways to optimize when we look at them as consumers. So things that are not necessarily obvious nor overtly targeted will start to define areas where engagement is higher, and we can use that information to build new segments and then start to overtly target based on those segments to get better response. So again, all of this data is, as with any programmatic company, integrated with lots of different forms of online inventory and addressable TV inventory, and then we can reach an audience which is primarily, as I said, an anonymous and aggregate audience across multiple screens. So why programmatic for HCP outreach? My intention here is not to suggest that programmatic replaces some of the other things that you are very likely doing to reach doctors, but it is very much that programmatic can supplement some of that outreach. And the reasons for that, I think, are many, kind of a convergence of events. One is decreased access to HCPs through traditional sales channels, and by that I primarily mean rep details and just the time that they get in front of physicians. I've got a chart on the next slide that shows that has, although it's stabilized recently, fairly consistently and significantly dropped over the past several years. Then variable response across traditional outreach tactics. So this is really just human behavior and also a function of clutter. We have ultimately a finite audience, and there are a number of people who are trying to reach this audience. So they get a lot of emails, they get a lot of direct mail, they get a lot of rep calls. So the ability to find them in different channels will help you engage with them at a higher rate. Increased consumption of digital media. This is certainly true, as we all know, across consumers in general, but across HCPs as well, particularly as we've seen on mobile devices. But it's become channels where they engage with content more, they do click on ads, they do go to landing pages, watch videos, consume content, et cetera. And in fact, many prefer to do it that way, and we'll talk about that later. And then increased acceptance of behavioral and programmatic targeting. So we all see the pair of shoes that we look at on Amazon follow us around the web, and that's one thing that we all expect. When we get into the world of healthcare, more so on the consumer side, but certainly on the HCP side as well, we need to be concerned with, being intrusive with the messaging and having the effect that is counter to what we're actually trying to achieve. That needle has moved consistently in the right direction over the past couple of years, and people understand that information is currency on the internet, and through cookies and IP targeting and other data sources, ads are very much targeted to who we are as professionals or as consumers. And then endemic HCP sites have some limitations. Again, not suggesting for a second to eliminate those. They very much are a core tactic to reaching HCPs, but they will have significantly, in fact, in some cases, an order of magnitude higher CPM. They will have limited reach unless you can put together a large network of HCP sites. You'll just be limited in your reach. Custom lists, some of these sites and networks do facilitate that process, but many of them still don't. So you're really limited to targeting based on geo, potentially by specialty, and potentially some other factors, but not to the degree that you are with programmatic in many cases. And then variable attribution capabilities. So again, programmatic is limited to a large extent into the aggregate and anonymous world, and we'll talk about exceptions to that in a minute, as are endemic HCP sites. So that's kind of why we believe programmatic has its place. Just a little bit of information on some of the points that I just made. This is from ZS Associates. It's part of a programmatic healthcare council that Audience Partners is participating in. Just some research showing that traditional access to prescribers has fairly consistently declined. This goes through 2015, and in fact, over the last couple of years, it has stabilized to some extent. But still, less than 50% of the HCP population is now considered accessible through some of the traditional tactics. And as that time in front of HCPs declines, concurrent to that, digital contact in terms of time and in terms of percentage of outreach has increased fairly significantly, and again, for a lot of the reasons that I just mentioned. So let's talk about maximizing reach, and specifically here when I'm talking about maximizing reach, my call waiting is ringing. I'll let that go to voicemail. Specifically here, when I'm talking about maximizing reach, I'm talking about who we're trying to reach, and I'll talk about a little bit later about where and when and how we reach them. But specifically here, I'm talking about data attributes across the process that can really kind of influence that number. So the typical process looks like this, and this is consistent whether you have a custom HCP list or whether there's an always-on database, which at some point begins as an offline source of some kind. So you start with a source list, again, whether that's kind of a broad list that's always on or a custom list of HCPs. That can then be onboarded through multiple channels and synchronized to some kind of online identifier, which can be a cookie, a mobile device ID, or an IP address, which then in turn gives you the ability to reach HCPs across multiple devices. Typically, we'll see at least 3 devices per HCP, in some cases significantly more, in some cases significantly less. And then you integrate with multiple inventory sources. So these are the DSPs and the DMPs and the ad networks. Facebook is on here. I've also included addressable television, which right now is not really a practical outreach channel for HCPs, but I am going to spend a few minutes today talking about it because I think very soon it will be, and it's certainly something that's a viable outreach channel for consumers at this point. So again, this is kind of the traditional process, and we'll address each step of this one by one. First is making sure your source list is built so that it matches at the highest possible rate. So this goes to the fidelity of the source list, the current nature of the source list. HCPs, like anybody, will change addresses, will move around, will retire, will enter the market, all of these different things. Our always-on HCP list is sourced from an AMA licensee, and many roads, in fact, do lead back to the AMA. But certainly there's other providers, for example, IMS Health, that can provide you source lists. We've seen good lists and we've seen bad lists. So there is some list hygiene that really does influence the match rate, which can vary pretty significantly. Verify permissions for use across channels. This typically does not become an issue, but often a list is rented or sourced for a very specific reason. More and more programmatic digital use is certainly allowed by it, but that's definitely something that you'd need to verify before you use it for programmatic targeting. And then maximize availability of match keys. So typically, the way that we match here is through an NPI number and or a business address and or a home address. The address tends to be the highest match rate. And again, depending on the channel and the process you're matching, this can vary. So the more match keys you have, the higher match rate you will get. What we do with the custom list is first we match it to our offline list, which is what powers our always-on database. This way we can append, for example, home address. That becomes very important for reasons that I'll discuss later. We can append an NPI number. We can scrub out PO boxes because those will not match. In some cases, we'll have email, mobile phone number. But again, the more of these you have, the higher the match rate's going to be. So we do this pre-match offline, and we append the missing match keys based on our database. And first it's matched online, again, across multiple providers. And a good list should yield always an offline match rate significantly above 90%. When we see it below that, it's typically a function of bad data of some type. PO boxes tend to be kind of a frequently occurring problem there. But then we match through multiple onboarding partners. So certainly there are commercially available cookie match partners like Newstar and LiveRamp, and we, in fact, do use both of them. We have a process here, and there are other processes that will afford a residential IP match, which does have some benefits. Some pharma advertisers just have restrictions on cookie targeting. Excuse me, IP matching tends to be more deterministic. There are fewer incidents of fraud in the IP world than there are in the cookie world. But again, we don't look at it as an either or. We try to create the superset of these things, which gives us ultimately the highest percentage. So what you see on the left is a Venn diagram that says through LiveRamp, you're going to match X percent, maybe 30, 35%. Through Newstar, you'll get a similar number. Through residential IP, you'll get a similar number. Kind of a fourth optional way is through a commercial IP match. Again, if you have business address, you can target the physician's facility Obviously, the problem with that, I don't know if it's a problem, but the difference with that, I should say, is that in that case, you're not targeting an individual, you're targeting that doctor's entire office, which would include the nursing staff, the office staff, the other doctors, and the patients who are there as well. But we have on some campaigns included that just to expand reach to some extent. But again, the idea is that you use multiple match partners. It can create some logistical complexity, but the benefit is pretty clear because the superset of those matches is much higher, not just incrementally, pretty significantly higher than any individual of those match processes, which again gives you a bigger addressable audience to match, which I think is a benefit for a lot of reasons. I'm going to spend a minute here talking about privacy because I think that's a question that frequently occurs. When we're in the consumer world, we are concerned with things like HIPAA. We are concerned with online privacy, obviously. With HCPs, it's less of a concern, HIPAA anyway, but certainly the online privacy and regulations is still very much a concern. So we need to look at how these match processes work. So in the cookie match world, a question that I'm asked a lot and that you're probably asked as well is how do we know that this is opt-in? Where has this doctor agreed at some point to receive digital marketing based on their identity? So Neustar and LiveRamp have fundamentally similar processes for this, although the technical implementation is different, where they work with a series of registration and match partners, e-commerce sites and publication sites where users will register either as a consumer or as a professional. And when we do the match, we can verify the ID based on a unique ID associated with this registration data. So the opt-in in those cases basically comes from the privacy policies of each one of those individual sites, which say, effectively, as a registered user of this site, we will sell your data to third parties who may use it to match your identity and to serve you digital marketing based on that identity. So, when you're asked how it's opt-in, there's opt-in and there's capital O opt-in. This is kind of a lowercase o opt-in because it is ultimately buried in the privacy policies, but it is consistent and compliant with online privacy regulations, and certainly there are ways to opt out, which I'll talk about in a second. When we do a residential IP match at Audience Partners, we work with 8 of the top 10 cable providers who are obviously in many cases ISPs as well, and therefore produce the IP address and issue the IP address. We have a way that we can match an offline list to the IP addresses across these carriers. It tends to be a more deterministic match. IP addresses can change, but again, we're working with the people who issue them, so we can make sure that we know through a billing relationship that we are reaching the right individual. And it can be a deterministic match. In this case, opt-in is a little bit different. Consumers, through their cable providers, are provided with the opportunity to opt out. As with many of those types of programs, very few do, but they are provided that capability. So this is compliant with FTC regulations as a result. So that's the opt-in. With regard to opt-out, typically we handle that 2 ways. One is through something similar to or including ad choices, where on each banner we serve there is an ad choices logo and the user can opt out from the program. The other is things like when we run Facebook campaigns, they have a mechanism to hide the ads, which is essentially an opt-out. On the IP match side, we can have people opt out at the source where, again, they can overtly opt out and are reminded of this with some frequency. So again, we try to be as visible as possible with opt-in and opt-out. Again, there are more overt ways to do this, but this is technically how the match process works and how the opt-in is compliant in those processes. So again, when we do a superset of multiple match partners, we can get matchback reports which tell us who was and who was not matched, and therefore we can determine what was the aggregate match. So if each one matches at 25%, certainly that doesn't mean we've matched at 100% in aggregate because of the overlap that you see there, but it is always significantly bigger than if we match through one of these partners. So we have found as a best practice to use multiple onboarding partners to maximize that number. And again, consider supplementing the match process through commercial IP, again, recognizing the limitations of that because you are not targeting an individual in that case. Just a little bit more about IP. So in general, that can come in two ways. Commercial IP specifically could be IP targeting of buildings where you're actually targeting the networks within those buildings, or geofencing of some kind. And geofencing can have a very tight radius. Geofencing comes in a lot of different forms. We work with a partner called Ubimo, who essentially is able to capture mobile signals of some type and then identify mobile devices that are either currently in an area or have been currently in a defined area at some point in time. In that case, the opt-in is actually secured through the iOS or Android OS or in the individual apps when you agree to location services and things like that. But geofencing is different fundamentally than IP targeting. There are two ways, however, to increase your reach. So rather than matching the doctor himself, you match the doctor's office. So there's a couple of different ways to do that. What you see on the right side of the screen when we talk about residential IP lookup, there are a number of providers that do this. What we have found when we've tried to verify the deterministic nature of these matches is that when you can match directly through the ISP or the cable provider who issues the IP address, it tends to be much higher fidelity in terms of the match. So what you see highlighted there is when you use algorithms or when you use an IP locator or lookup as your source for IP, the tool is not 100% accurate. So there are many reasons why that may happen, but precision is key here. So while you think you're targeting a physician in his home or office, you may be targeting a centroid or you may be targeting something several blocks away, which obviously defeats the purpose. So there are lots of different flavors of IP. You need to kind of consider the limitations and benefits of each. The vertical conundrum is something that's interesting. It's a similar issue as they have in the 911 call world right now, which is while we can identify a lat and long location with very high specificity, it's very difficult to determine are they on the third floor in the doctor's office or are they on the first floor in the deli downstairs. So that's something else to consider when you do geofencing. And again, there are ways to minimize that effect and there are ways to be more precise, but definitely something that should be considered as part of that. The next part is matching to multiple devices. So I'd mentioned early on that one of the things that we do when we get a source list is we can append the NPI number and or the business address with a home address. So we get this data through LexisNexis, and we certainly don't have 100% coverage of it. But what it enables us to do is reach an HCP in their home and office personas, actually devices. And certainly there are devices that are used in the business and the home office, but it does give us much broader reach in terms of average number of devices per HCP. We can typically get more than 3, which is good for a number of reasons. One, it increases reach significantly. It gives us a lot more leverage to hit when we do optimization, but it also allows for more nuance in targeting as we talk about channel preference. So we will start to see subsegments of HCPs, and this varies across specialty, but even within specialty, as I'll talk about how we define that in a minute, where they just prefer to use the mobile device or they prefer to use a tablet or they have a desktop, and that may vary based on time of day. So this is all data that we can use to really put our thumb on the scale in terms of engagement. The last point is consider the impact of shared devices, and this is a question that I get a lot as well, as do probably you. When we talk about IP matching, we're talking about matching a household. There are often shared devices even with cookie matches. So how can we protect against the doctor or the physician, his or herself, seeing an ad, or their spouse, or their teenage child, or their 5-year-old child seeing an ad? The answer is you cannot protect against that 100%, but we can certainly do things with contextual placement. We can certainly do things with day part. And again, mobile devices tend to be shared less frequently, but it definitely is something to consider. There are some pharma sponsors that consider this kind of enough reason not to go big into programmatic. Others understand this as acceptable risk. Really the only risk is, it would be a wasted impressions ultimately if a 15-year-old daughter of a physician was looking at an ad. That's not your intended audience. So definitely something to keep in mind. And then moving along the chain, we have multiple devices, we've got multiple match processes, we've appended the list to make sure it's as clean as possible. We then want to integrate it with multiple inventory sources. So primarily here we focus on DSPs and ad networks, and I think it's a common misconception that, you know, if you use Turn or you use Trade Desk or you use DBM or someone else, that effectively you are getting the same stuff. That's true to an extent. There's no question about that. There is significant overlap in the inventory between those DSPs. But there's also incremental inventory available. So as you start to use the same data source across multiple DSPs, you will start to get higher reach in terms of unique individuals and devices. And the graph that you see on the right shows a campaign that we did where we layered in an additional DSP a few days in. So as you would expect, the number of uniques that we can reach across one DSP, which is in the blue, will increase naturally over time because we'll just be able to access more. But as we add in additional inventory sources, you can see that's sort of the coral color there, that creates an incremental value that we can also reach. So it's not insignificant. Again, each one of these things that I've just talked about can increase your reach incrementally by a few percentage points or by 10 percentage points. And here we see maybe 10 or 15%. But in aggregate, it does in fact become fairly significant. And that's what's shown on this slide. So if you take kind of the basic approach and you have a source list and you've got maybe one match key that's business address and you match it through one onboarding partner, let's say LiveRamp, you're going to reach a certain number of devices and you integrate that data into one single DSP, you can see the net effect. You kind of lose fidelity as you move from left to right. On the bottom, you see a source list that's scrubbed. It includes multiple match keys. We use multiple match partners. It gives us a much higher number of total devices, but we also integrate that with multiple DSPs. So again, incremental effects at each of these four stages tends to be a pretty significant impact on reach. So, you know, these numbers are not actual, but they're based on, you know, similar numbers that we've seen before, whereas you start with 20,000 oncologists in example A and end up with 5,600. In example B, you start with the same 20,000 and you end up with more than twice as many. So again, if you can pay attention to each of these steps, you can significantly increase your reach, which is good in and of itself because many of these campaigns tend to be focused primarily on branding. So the more people we can reach, the better. But it also builds bidding efficiencies because, again, you have more inventory, you have more reach, you have more room to maneuver within that inventory. And you also have more devices, which gives you more data that can be used to define channel preferences. So targeting precision, and this is actually where I'm going to talk about who we are going to reach. And let's change my notes here. Oh, there we go. Comes in kind of two forms, the typical campaigns we do. As I mentioned before, one is custom list targeting. This is almost always driven by client demand. Custom lists represent a slight majority of the campaigns that we do, and I believe probably an even bigger majority of the HCP targeting campaigns in general. So this includes obviously some kind of custom scoring based on internal analytics or IMS health data or CRM data, and custom scores and custom segments, you know, based on, you know, an analysis of a fair amount of attributes. So in this case, we get, excuse me, a list that says, you know, this is list A, and in some ways we're indifferent to what defines that list. We just know that this is the optimal list. The kind of plain vanilla version of always-on targeting is by specialty and by geo. But for both of these, there are lots of additional attributes that we can include for who we reach, which again provides us a lot more optimization, a lot better engagement, a lot more nuance to how we do the campaigns. So on one level, you can work with, and we do work with, the IMS Health, the Symphonies, the LexisNexuses of the world to provide additional data that can be used for more precise targeting. This commonly includes things like prescription data, affiliations with health systems and payers and purchasing groups, peer networks, academic information, et cetera. So what you see on the right is an IMS product called OneKey, which includes many of those things. The issue with these is the pricing models can be expensive. Now, many of you or many of your clients will have these subscriptions and these services available, but in some cases you don't. And when we talk about programmatic, the campaigns tend to be smaller in size, shorter in duration, certainly smaller audiences. So when you factor in this additional cost, in many cases it can just be cost prohibitive, and the extra precision just simply doesn't outweigh, or the value of the extra precision simply doesn't outweigh the extra cost. So what we use as a proxy right now, among other things, but one of the things we do use are ICD-9 and 10 codes. So these are procedural codes and diagnosis codes, which I think you would agree would be a reasonable proxy for prescription data, would certainly give more specificity into types of conditions that an HCP is treating. So ICD-10 codes, there are 150,000, a little more than that in total across procedures and diagnoses versus about 18,000 ICD-10 codes. Point there is you can be very precise with how these are segmented. Again, if you have a pharma advertiser, they're not necessarily interested in every doctor or every doctor that treats diabetes in this case, but doctors who treat a very specific form of diabetes because they will be the ones who are most relevant for the product that's being advertised. So we can get not just inclusion of or presence of certain ICD-10 codes, but also frequency of these codes. So maybe you want to ignore the bottom half or the bottom couple deciles and focus on those that more frequently treat patients. This data tends to primarily come from managed care claims, Medicare and Medicaid, but again, as a proxy for treating patients with very specific conditions, this tends to be very good, and the cost is democratized. In other words, we can make this cost work on a CPM model. It's a very low incremental cost. You don't have to go into IMS for 6 figures worth of analysis and analytics or subscriptions. So if you don't have those relationships, this tends to be a very good proxy for that. And then we talk about kind of the consumer side of the HCP. So, what we've talked about so far are prescriptions and procedures and affiliations, and those are all obviously very important to advertisers to be targeted overtly. But what we do on campaigns is we start to look at the consumer attributes which define an HCP. We do this through a data management platform. We can provide a readout across pre-built segments, which can then be analyzed across thousands of attributes. Many of those attributes will be completely meaningless because they won't necessarily bubble up as an area of opportunity, but some will, and that will allow us to create subsegments that we can then start to provide more nuance on with messaging and channel and frequency and all of these things. It could be political ideology, it could be demographics of some type, geography, it could be lifestyle or life events that just inherently create more engagement. So it enables us to create more granular, more finite segments that we can be more nuanced and more optimized in the approach. And again, there are thousands of attributes that we can analyze here, and we often do, again, to kind of create this nuance. This becomes particularly important to inform things like ad placement and site context, because these, in fact, are some of the attributes which bubble up in this type of analysis. So we've talked so far about the who, but again, ultimately campaign success will depend on where and when and how often. So that's what I'll talk about now, and this really all falls under the category of performance data. So first, where to reach HCPs, and by this I mean site context. So, initially we're often asked, I only want to be on health content, or I only want to be on medical journals. We can do this programmatically, but when you intersect a finite audience with a finite set of websites, you tend to get very, very small reach, and in fact, trickles of impressions are served out. So for that reason alone, we need to expand the reach a little bit. But more importantly, as you see here, and this is really just an aggregate view, lots of different types of sites tend to generate response. So these are the top categories of sites across hundreds of campaigns that we've done. So news and email, and by that I mean email portal sites where they sign on. Medical, as you see, is a fairly small minority in many cases. In some cases, it's more than half of the impressions we serve. But in aggregate, it's a very small percentage. And then the rest are just consumer site type sites, news and sports and finance. Weather tends to be one, strangely, that HCPs not only tend to visit with some frequency, they tend to engage with a very good frequency. So again, based on hundreds of millions of impressions, we can start to see not only what are the categories of sites that we're serving ads on, but how does this vary by specialty? And it does. And how can we use this to create ultimately whitelists or at least directionally inform the categories of sites that we use based on response? So weather and email sites tend to generate the best click-through rates. Gaming and music sites, which are on here at a lower percentage, tend to have lower engagement rates. That, I believe, is a function of the intent through which you go to one of these websites. When you go to the weather, you check and you're kind of done. You can then kind of move on. When you go to a gaming site, you're playing a game, and you may see the ad, but you're less likely to click on it because you're actually doing something else. Ditto with music. So they're not worthless, but they are worth less than some of the other types of sites because, again, we see higher engagement. So, again, we can provide lots of detail behind this. It varies by specialty. It varies by specific site. But the point ultimately is that it's not always going to be an endemic medical site or healthcare site where you're going to get response because, again, doctors are ultimately consumers as well. And then when to reach healthcare professionals. So this goes to day and day part. This is just an example of, again, some of the hundreds of campaigns that we've run. When we look at this in aggregate, we do notice that it does vary by specialty. As you can imagine, the life of an oncologist versus a cardiologist versus a surgeon versus a primary care physician is going to differ. And we can account for that and start to look at different days and day parts. So here you can see weekends, specifically Sunday. You can see late night hours that have higher engagement. And there are a few outliers here, but we certainly make sure that there's statistical relevance before we start to allocate across day parts. But again, this underscores the importance of reaching via a home and business persona or device. If you're only matching based on business address and you're only reaching business devices, you may not be able to reach the doctor at 3 in the morning, where in fact we do see fairly good response. This is just a little more data on that. Again, this was a survey that says, when do HCPs prefer to receive information? And kind of the point here is it varies by specialty. But if you look at predominantly it's evenings. Weekends is a little less. They tend to actually engage a little higher on weekends. But again, the point is when you serve the ad will significantly determine the engagement that you have with the ad. And then how to reach, so this goes to channel preference. Again, we do multi-channel campaigns. We can research multiple data points and look at engagement by channel, by OS, by device, by all of these things, so we can start to observe in actual campaigns where we're getting better response. Now we have to normalize this because mobile devices always get higher click-through rates than desktop devices, and Facebook always gets higher click-through rates than either. So we want to normalize that a little bit based on volume and based on conversion and based on different benchmarks. But the other input will be the DMP data that I talked about before, where we start to read out the consumer attributes and we can start to segment by channel preference because we do have a lot of data for people who prefer to receive email or who prefer to use a mobile device or who prefer direct mail. So this is not just digital. This is any kind of outreach that you may be using. We can get data to inform this. And this, again, tends to be the holy grail. If we've got X number of dollars, how do we allocate across different channels? So I'm only going to spend a minute here because I'm running out of time, and I do want to get to some of the attribution stuff. I see a question on that. But the idea here is that we can also look at multi-channel effect. This example is actually a consumer example, but I wanted to just include a reason to talk about addressable TV because I think that's certainly something to be considered on the consumer side now, but something that I do believe will be a viable form of outreach for HCPs as that technology democratizes a little bit. But the point is, and we see this consistently when we look at email and digital or mail and digital or some combination of all of those things, that when we combine multiple channels, not only do we get more reach, we get better recall for the brand, for the message, and we get better conversion. So again, not only can we use multiple channels, we can attribute what is the right allocation across those channels, and we can do this at a very granular segment level. And a slight digression here on addressable TV, just what I mean by that. Again, household addressable by set-top box, very much in the world of consumers now. When we talk about matching a list, we very much match to digital devices, but also addressable TV. The way we treat HCPs with Addressable today is we will include them as part of a consumer match. Obviously, they're getting the same commercial or creative as the consumer, but there is value, certainly residual value in having the doctors get awareness as part of a consumer campaign. But I do believe as this technology democratizes, you'll be able to buy smaller campaigns against smaller audiences. And I think that this has proven to be an excellent way to reach consumers in pharma. I believe it will be an excellent way to reach HCPs. And then lastly, on performance data, how often to reach them. The point on this slide probably won't surprise you. It's that there is a saturation point. We have a fairly finite audience here, and your agency or your brand is not the only one trying to reach cardiologists or endocrinologists or whatever that audience may be. So we start to reach saturation points. We don't want to underserve, because you'll see on the bottom, the majority of the conversions will occur after a certain saturation level of impressions. But at that similar or at the same or similar saturation level, we'll start to see a decline in performance, lower click-through rates, higher cost per click. So you really need to find a balance. We've seen campaigns that are driven by frequency goals of, sometimes more than 100 a month. And again, if branding is the goal here, that's certainly relevant and valuable. But if some kind of conversion or engagement is being measured, there is a saturation point that is significantly lower than that. And typically, we see 5 or 6 times a week as that magic number. So, you really want to find the balance there. So how often, again, this is informed by some of the performance data. So lastly, measurement, and I do see a question here on measurement, and I will address the individual attribution level. But first I will say, in the world of programmatic, due to privacy regulations, we don't live in the world of PII. We live in the world of segments, and those can be very small segments, but they are typically, not always, this says always, aggregate and anonymous segments rather than individuals. So sometimes this can be a limitation to budget allocations, because with email, for example, you can do individual attribution. When you're targeting on registered, sites with registered users, you can do individual attribution. There are ways in programmatic to do individual attribution, but it's fairly nascent. It's not imperfect. We do believe that there are some really good ways to do this. And in fact, we have recently started talking to a company that you may be familiar with called DMD, who has a process to do individual attribution. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But in general, programmatic is in the world of anonymous and aggregate. You can have granular segments, but they are still segments, not individuals. So talk a little bit about what we can do. At a basic level, we can do matchback reports. I've talked about those before. This will minimally tell you who matched and who didn't. It's not necessarily who was exposed and who wasn't, because we won't necessarily reach everyone, but we can get that data too. For example, Newstar will provide an exposure report by individual that you can then map back. For a brief period of time, they offered an engagement report where you could, by individual, talk about things like clicks. They currently do not offer that. They may at some point, but they thought that there were some gray areas with privacy that really shouldn't be crossed there. But certainly right out of the box, you can get a matchback report and you can get exposure reports. That's kind of the basic level. But really what you're concerned with and what your clients are concerned with are clicks and post-click engagement. So again, typically in programmatic, we live in the world of segments. They can be very granular segments, but they are still segments. Sites that have some kind of registered users and have done sufficient opt-in can certainly report on individual clicks, but also engagements based on GA data, et cetera. In any programmatic campaign, users can self-identify through a form complete or something like that, but that's always going to be a small percentage of what you do. I'd mentioned DMD, who we've been talking to for the past several weeks. I mentioned to them that I'd be mentioning them on this webinar. Many of you probably work with them right now, but they do have a persistent identity management software, and we're going to pilot a lot of this stuff in programmatic, which, as long as a user is registered through their platform, we can do individual HCP attribution. So that can be by name and by NPI and by specialty, which can then be associated directly with any kind of unique ID that you have, and then can be reported on an individual basis. So at the end of the day, the report says, Dr. Smith saw this many impressions, clicked on this many ads, and then when they were on the landing page, they engaged in these types of activities. So match rate, I see a little note on that. Good point. That has increased pretty significantly over time. Again, in programmatic at any level, we don't live in the world of 100% at any level. But as their network grows, and I've seen some data that has shown that even over the past 6 months, certainly across key specialties, but across the board, they're getting fairly good registration for their identifier, and therefore can be read by their reader. So again, we're in the world of 50%, 60% in some cases. That varies by specialty. I have seen evidence that is growing over time, and certainly I believe that will continue to grow. We don't live in the world of 100%, but in terms of individual attribution, we can absolutely determine who was matched, who was exposed, and then some slight majority percentage of who clicked and who engaged. And this is ultimately going to feed into your CRM and then start to define lots of the other things that I talked about, which today we optimize based on segment. At some point, we will be able to optimize based on individual, channel preference, site context, day part, all of these things. We'll be able to provide a lot more nuance in that regard. So it looks like I am out of time, but I will summarize quickly here. So programmatic digital outreach is becoming increasingly important. It's certainly not new, but it is really becoming an increasingly bigger part of HCP outreach, and that's driven by a lot of reasons. I think primarily effectiveness, cost efficiency, and just ability to get high reach. This reach across HCPs can be significantly increased on multiple levels. So if you optimize your data, you optimize your match processes, you optimize your publisher integrations, you will get significantly better reach. There are a number of data assets available to allow for highly precise targeting. Again, a custom list is going to have this inherent on the HCP side, but there are consumer attributes which we've seen which can very much inform subsegments of the audience, site context placement, day part, media channel preference, all of these things. Programmatic primarily focuses on who, but we can look at performance data and use it to inform, and we've got a critical mass that shows differences across specialty to say here's where they're going to be, here's when they're going to be there, here's how often to reach them, and here's the channel through which to reach them. And again, if you can optimize each of these incrementally, what you have at the end of the day is a pretty significantly better result. And then lastly, although privacy regulations tend to restrict perfect attribution or individual attribution, there are a number of tools that have emerged. We can do the basic stuff for sure at a census level, and then we are working towards and piloting things that we believe are very effective ways to do attribution of clicks and engagements, et cetera. So that's all I have. I'm a little bit over time now. There were a couple of questions that popped up that I did answer kind of ongoing. One other question that did just pop up is how small is too small an audience for custom HCPs? We've done fairly small audiences. There's kind of two barriers to that. One is just logistical. Campaigns require setup, campaigns require reporting, campaigns require all of these things. So while in theory we could target a very small list of HCPs, and we've been asked to find oncologists who treat very rare forms of cancer, and there's like 15 of them, logistically it's just not efficient. There are better ways to reach a small audience. But the other thing that kind of comes into play are a lot of the DSPs and the match partners. If you create segments below a certain amount, it will just show up as zero. It is not literally zero, but if it's below a certain number, and that number can be 1,000, it can be several hundred, you won't find an audience to reach, so you can't do it. I would say a small audience for us is probably about 5,000 as a source list, which again will match maybe a little more than half of that. And a big audience is never more than 40 or 50,000, just based on the nature of what we do here. And then a last question about Facebook, which I did touch on. Does it work for HCPs? I would say, in general, yes. It's become increasingly important to what we do for consumers, but we have started to integrate it for HCPs as well. So again, we approach it with custom audience data. Match key is primarily email address on Facebook, but there's a number of other match keys that you can use. And we find that the custom audience data that we use, whether it's ours or yours, does perform better than some of the Facebook attributes that you can target. And again, they act like consumers. We do see people that say, hide this ad. We do see people, we do see click-through rates and engagement rates, and they are, in fact, very similar to what we see on the consumer side. So I will say that, again, over the past several months to several years, Facebook has emerged as a really primary tactic, not just on the consumer side, but on the HCP side, for all the reasons that I've said today: increased reach, increased engagement, increased precision with measurement, all of those different things. So apologize for going 5 minutes over. I appreciate your attending today's event. You will get an email following up at some point with sort of a video on-demand version of this, so you'll see the presentation. You'll be able to hear my voice again as well. And if you have any questions, you have my email there at the bottom of the screen. And I appreciate your time, and thank you very much.